Frank Miller pushed open the glass door of the gun shop on a Tuesday afternoon. The bell above made a small ringing sound as he walked inside. He was 72 years old with gray hair and hands that showed his age. His navy baseball cap sat on his head, faded from years of wear. The jacket he wore was old but clean. Frank needed to buy a rifle for his hunting trip with his grandson. It was something they did every year, and this year he wanted a new Winchester. The shop owner stood behind the counter looking at his phone. His name was Craig Patterson, and he barely looked up when Frank entered. A younger man was stacking boxes near the back wall. That was Danny, Craig's nephew who helped out at the shop most days. The store smelled like gun oil and leather, with rifles lined up in glass cases along the walls. Frank walked slowly to the counter and waited politely for Craig to finish whatever he was doing on his phone. After a long minute, Craig finally looked up at him. His eyes went from Frank's face down to his worn jacket and old boots, then back up again. Something changed in Craig's expression. It was not friendly. Frank cleared his throat and spoke in his quiet, steady voice. He asked if he could see one of the Winchester rifles in the display case. He pointed to the one he meant, a beautiful hunting rifle that would be perfect for the mountains. Craig put his phone down slowly and looked at Frank like he was wasting his time. He said the rifles were expensive. Maybe Frank should try the pawn shop down the street instead. His voice was not kind when he said it. Frank felt heat rise in his face, but he kept calm like he had learned to do over 30 years in the military. He told Craig that he had money and just wanted to look at the rifle. His voice stayed level and respectful even though he was starting to feel angry inside. Danny laughed from where he stood by the ammunition boxes. He said something about old people with shaky hands not being able to shoot anymore. He looked at his uncle and they both smiled like they were sharing a private joke at Frank's expense. Craig leaned on the counter and spoke again. He said they were busy today and Frank should probably shop somewhere else. He used words that sounded polite, but the meaning behind them was clear. He did not want Frank in his store. He said they catered to serious buyers, not people who were just looking to kill time. Other customers in the shop turned to watch what was happening. A woman in her 40s looked uncomfortable and turned away. Two young men standing near the pistol display started whispering to each other and laughing quietly. Frank could feel their eyes on him, could feel the weight of their judgment. He had served his country for more than 30 years. He had earned medals that sat in a box at home. He had trained hundreds of young men and women to be warriors. He had seen combat and survived things most people could not imagine. And now he stood in a gun shop being treated like he was nothing. Frank took a deep breath and nodded slowly. He said he understood and would take his business somewhere else. His voice did not shake even though something inside him felt broken. Dignity mattered to him more than getting into an argument with someone who did not understand respect. As he turned to walk toward the door, Craig called after him. He said there were no hard feelings and that he was just running a business. The words sounded false and made everything worse somehow. Frank did not answer. He walked to the door and pulled it open. The bell rang again as he stepped outside into the afternoon sunlight. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment trying to make sense of what had just happened. Then he walked to his old truck in the parking lot and got inside. He sat there with his hands on the steering wheel for several minutes. The anger had faded and been replaced by something sadder. It hurt that his service meant nothing to people like Craig Patterson. It hurt that being old and wearing worn clothes made people think he was not worth their time. But mostly it hurt because he knew there was nothing he could do about it. Frank started his truck and drove home slowly through the afternoon traffic. He decided he would just order a rifle online and forget the whole thing. There was no point in dwelling on one bad experience. He had dealt with worse things in his life. What Frank did not know was that someone in the shop had recognized him. A man in his 30s named Alan Hughes had been standing near the back looking at scopes when Frank walked in. Alan had served under Frank years ago during his first deployment overseas. He remembered everything Frank had taught him about being a soldier and being a good man. Alan had watched the whole scene with growing anger burning in his chest. When Frank left the shop, Alan put down the scope he was holding and walked out as well. He did not say anything to Craig or Danny. He just left and went to his car. Once inside his vehicle, Alan pulled out his phone. His hands were shaking slightly as he scrolled through his contacts. Frank Miller had been more than just a commanding officer to him. Frank had saved his life during a mission gone wrong. Frank had written the letter of recommendation that helped Alan get his current job. Frank had been at Alan's wedding and had given advice when Alan's first child was born. Seeing him treated with such disrespect made Alan feel like he had been punched in the stomach. He knew he had to do something. He had to let people know what had happened. Within the military community, Frank Miller was a legend. People respected him and loved him for what he had done and who he was. Alan started making phone calls. He called Pete Carson first, then Jack Monroe, then Steve Palmer. Each person he talked to had the same reaction. Shock, then anger, then determination to do something about it. Alan explained where Frank lived and what had happened at the gun shop. He asked them to spread the word to everyone they knew who had served with Frank or been trained by him. The calls spread quickly from person to person like ripples on water. Alan sat in his car outside the gun shop with his phone pressed to his ear. His heart was beating fast and he could feel anger making his muscles tight. Pete Carson answered on the second ring with his usual calm voice asking what was going on. Alan told him everything he had just witnessed inside the shop. He described how Frank Miller had been treated with disrespect and kicked out like he was garbage. He explained who Craig Patterson was and exactly what had been said. His voice shook a little as he talked because the whole thing still made him furious. Pete was quiet for a few seconds after Alan finished talking. Then he spoke and his voice had changed completely. He asked if Alan was talking about Commander Frank Miller, the same man who had trained half the special operations personnel in the region. Alan said yes, that was exactly who he meant. Pete said some words that showed how angry he was. He asked where Alan was right now and what the plan was. Alan said he was about to drive to Frank's house to check on him. But first he wanted to get the word out to everyone who had served with Frank or been trained by him. Pete told Alan to give him 10 minutes. He would start making calls immediately. Before hanging up, Pete said this would not stand and that Frank Miller deserved better than what had happened. Alan sat back in his seat, feeling slightly better knowing that Pete was already taking action. Pete Carson was good at organizing people and getting things done quickly. If anyone could rally the troops, it was Pete. Pete hung up with Alan and immediately looked through his phone contacts. He had hundreds of numbers from his years in the Navy and his current work as a security contractor. He started calling people one by one, each conversation short but powerful. He called Jack Monroe, who had been a sniper in their old unit and now taught firearms training to law enforcement. Jack listened to what Pete told him and immediately said he would be there within the hour. He asked for the address of the gun shop and said he was bringing some friends. Pete called Steve Palmer next. Steve ran a veteran support organization and knew practically every veteran in 3 counties. When Steve heard what happened to Frank Miller, he said he would send out a mass message to everyone in his network. He asked Pete to send him all the details so he could include them in the message. Lisa Hayes was the next call. She had been a Navy medic and had worked under Frank's command during 2 tours overseas. When Pete explained what happened, Lisa actually started crying on the phone. She said Frank Miller was the reason she was still alive, and that she would drop everything to be there for him. The calls continued for the next 20 minutes. Each person Pete contacted had the same reaction: shock, anger, and immediate commitment to do something. They all asked the same questions about where and when, and they all said they would spread the word to others. Within 30 minutes, the information had reached more than 50 people. Text messages started flying between groups of veterans who had served together. Someone created a group chat and added dozens of people to it. The messages came so fast that phones were buzzing constantly. A retired Marine named George Clark got a text message while he was at the VFW post. He read it twice to make sure he understood correctly. Then he stood up and addressed everyone in the room. He told them what had happened to Frank Miller and asked who wanted to go stand with him. Every single person in the room raised their hand. Meanwhile, Alan had driven to Frank's house on the edge of town. It was a small place with a neat lawn and an American flag hanging by the front door. Alan walked up the steps and knocked, not sure what he would say when Frank answered. Frank opened the door looking surprised to see him. He asked what Alan was doing there and invited him inside. The living room had photos covering the walls, pictures from Frank's military career mixed with family photographs. Alan took a deep breath and told Frank that he had been in the gun shop when everything happened. He said he saw how Craig Patterson treated him and it was completely wrong. Frank tried to wave it off, saying it was nothing and that he had dealt with worse things in his life. But Alan shook his head and pulled out his phone. He showed Frank the stream of messages that were flooding in from all over the region. Frank's eyes got wide as he scrolled through the messages, seeing name after name of people he had served with or trained over the years. Frank sat down heavily in his chair and kept reading. There were messages from people he had not talked to in 10 years. There were messages from young veterans he barely remembered training. There were messages from officers and enlisted personnel, from SEALs and Marines and Army Rangers. All of them were saying the same thing. They were coming to stand with him. Frank looked up at Alan with confusion on his face. He said Alan should not have done this and that it was too much. He did not want people making a big deal out of something small. Alan sat down across from Frank and spoke seriously. He said with respect that it was not small and it was not nothing. He explained that Frank had spent his entire life teaching them about honor and loyalty and taking care of each other. Now it was their turn to show Frank that they had learned those lessons. Frank was quiet for a long moment. His eyes looked wet like he might cry, but he did not. He asked what everyone was planning to do. Alan smiled a little and said Frank would see soon enough. He just needed to trust them and let them handle this their way. He promised that nothing bad would happen and that everything would be done with honor. Outside, cars were already starting to arrive in town. People who lived within an hour's drive were hitting the road immediately. Those who lived farther away were booking flights or making arrangements to get there as soon as possible. The message had gone out through the veteran community like a signal fire, and warriors from all over were responding to the call. Frank Miller had been disrespected, and his brothers and sisters in arms were not going to let that stand without a response. Pete Carson pulled his truck into the parking lot of the gun shop at exactly 4 o'clock. He parked right in front where everyone could see his vehicle. On the back window was a sticker that said Navy SEAL Veteran. He turned off the engine and sat there waiting. Within 5 minutes, more vehicles started arriving. Jack Monroe rode up on his motorcycle and parked next to Pete's truck. Steve Palmer came in a Jeep with a Marine Corps flag attached to the back. One by one, trucks and cars filled every space in the parking lot and then started lining up along the street. Men and women got out of their vehicles and gathered near the front of the shop. Some wore ball caps with their old unit names on them. Others had tactical gear or military patches on their jackets. They ranged in age from their late 20s to their 70s. What they all had in common was the way they stood straight and looked serious. By 4:30, more than 60 veterans had gathered outside the shop. They did not block the door or make threats. They just stood there in loose groups, talking quietly among themselves. But their presence was impossible to ignore. Inside the shop, Craig Patterson noticed the crowd forming through the window. At first he thought maybe there was some kind of event happening down the street. But as more people arrived and he saw the military gear and flags, his stomach started to feel tight with worry. Danny came over and looked out the window too. He asked his uncle what was going on out there. Craig had no idea, but something told him it had to do with the old man he had kicked out earlier. Craig walked to the door and stepped outside, trying to look confident even though his hands were shaking slightly. He asked if he could help anyone with something. Pete Carson stepped forward from the crowd. He was a big man, tall and broad with the kind of calm that comes from years of handling dangerous situations. He looked at Craig and spoke in a clear, steady voice. Pete said they were there about Frank Miller. Craig blinked and asked who that was. Pete's jaw tightened and he explained that Frank Miller was the elderly man Craig had kicked out of his shop earlier that day. The one Craig had insulted and disrespected. Craig's face went pale. He tried to say it was just a misunderstanding and that he did not mean anything by it. His voice came out higher than normal. Alan Hughes stepped up beside Pete and listed everything Craig had said to Frank. He mentioned the comments about being an old-timer and needing to go to a pawn shop. He brought up the mocking of Frank's hands and the statement about not being a serious buyer. Each word made Craig look more uncomfortable. More veterans moved closer, forming a semicircle around Craig. Nobody raised their voice or made threats. They did not need to. The sheer number of them standing together was more powerful than any words could be. Craig stammered that he did not know who Frank was. Jack Monroe asked coldly if that mattered. He wanted to know if Craig thought it was okay to judge people by how they looked and treat them badly, just because they seemed old or poor. Craig looked around desperately like he was hoping someone would help him. The few customers who had been in the shop had already left quietly. Nobody wanted to be part of what was happening. Finally, Craig asked who Frank Miller was and why all these people cared so much. Steve Palmer stepped forward holding a tablet computer. He turned it around so Craig could see the screen. The tablet showed photographs of Frank Miller in his Navy uniform from years ago. There were pictures of him with his platoon, receiving medals from senior officers and training groups of young SEALs. Steve explained that Frank was a retired Navy commander with 32 years of service. He had 3 combat tours and a Silver Star. He had trained over 200 special operations personnel, including many of the people standing there right now. Craig felt like his legs might give out. He said again that he had no idea who Frank was. Lisa Hayes spoke up sharply and said that was exactly the point. Craig should have treated Frank with respect regardless of who he was. But since Craig only seemed to understand respect through rank and reputation, they wanted to make it clear that he had just disrespected a legend. Other veterans started speaking up then. An older man with gray hair said Frank Miller had saved his life in Iraq by pulling him from a burning vehicle while under enemy fire. A younger man said Frank wrote the recommendation letter that got him into SEAL training. A woman said Frank mentored her through her first deployment when she thought she could not make it. One by one, people shared their stories about Frank. Each story hit Craig like a physical blow. He had thought Frank was just some random old man who wandered into his shop. He had no idea he was insulting someone who meant so much to so many people. Craig asked in a quiet, shaky voice what they wanted from him. Pete looked at the gathered crowd and then back at Craig. He said they wanted Craig to understand what he had done. They wanted him to think about how he treated people, and they wanted him to make things right. Craig asked how he could do that. Pete said Craig was going to apologize to Frank Miller in person, and he was going to mean it. Craig nodded quickly and said he would go see Frank right away. Alan said not yet because they were not finished. More people were still arriving. The crowd had grown to almost 80 veterans now. Some brought American flags that waved in the afternoon breeze. Others just stood with their arms crossed, faces stern and serious. A reporter named Helen Brooks arrived with a photographer. She worked for the local newspaper and had heard about a large gathering at the gun shop. She approached Pete carefully and asked if she could ask some questions about what was happening. Pete thought for a moment and then agreed. He explained that they were standing up for one of their own. A decorated veteran had been disrespected at this business, and they were making sure the owner understood that actions have consequences. He did not exaggerate or make threats. He just stated the facts clearly. Helen took notes and asked more questions. The photographer started taking pictures of the crowd. The image of so many veterans standing together in solidarity made a powerful photograph. Craig stood off to the side, feeling sick to his stomach. His phone kept buzzing with notifications. People were already posting about this on social media. His business page was getting negative comments. Everything was falling apart because of one stupid decision he made. Helen Brooks finished her interview with Pete and immediately called her editor at the newspaper. She explained what was happening and said they needed to get the story online as soon as possible. Her editor agreed and told her to write it up quickly while the photographer processed the images. Helen sat in her car and typed the article on her laptop. She included quotes from Pete and descriptions of the crowd. She explained who Frank Miller was and what Craig Patterson had done. She made sure to focus on the facts without making the story more dramatic than it already was. The article went live on the newspaper's website at 5 o'clock. Within minutes, people started sharing it on social media. The story spread quickly through the small town and then beyond. Comments poured in from people expressing support for Frank and anger at how he had been treated. Local veterans organizations saw the article and immediately started mobilizing. George Clark, who ran the VFW post, called an emergency meeting. He gathered 10 other members and they all drove to the gun shop together to show their support. When George arrived, he walked straight to where Pete and the other veterans stood. He announced loudly that the VFW stood with Frank Miller and that any veteran who had been disrespected deserved their support. The crowd welcomed them and the numbers kept growing. The story continued to spread online. Veterans groups on social media picked it up and shared it with their followers. Soon people from other states were commenting and sharing their own stories about being disrespected or about meeting Frank Miller years ago. A retired Marine general named Andrew Cole was scrolling through his social media when he saw the story. He had served with Frank decades ago and still considered him a friend. Andrew immediately picked up his phone and called Frank's number. Frank answered, sounding tired. Andrew asked if he was okay, and Frank said he was fine, but confused about why everyone was making such a big deal about this. Andrew told him that the veteran community was rallying because Frank represented something important to all of them. When one of their best was disrespected, everyone felt it. Frank tried to say he did not ask for any of this attention. Andrew laughed and said that was exactly why Frank deserved it. Frank never asked for recognition or praise. He just did his job with honor for over 30 years. That kind of character was rare and worth defending. Before Frank could argue, Andrew said he was making some calls to national veterans organizations. He wanted to make sure this story reached the right people, and that Frank got the recognition he deserved. Frank protested, but Andrew had already hung up. True to his word, Andrew spent the next hour contacting people. He called the heads of several major veterans organizations and explained what had happened. He sent them links to the news article. He asked them to help spread the story and support Frank however they could. Back at the gun shop, Craig Patterson watched his phone explode with notifications. His business social media pages were being flooded with negative comments. People were saying they would never shop there again. Some were calling for boycotts. Others were leaving one-star reviews on every website that would accept them. Danny showed his phone to Craig with a worried expression. The negative attention was spreading fast and getting worse. Craig felt panic rising in his chest. He had built this business over 15 years, and now it was all falling apart in a matter of hours. Craig went back outside where the crowd of veterans had grown even larger. There were now over 100 people gathered. Some had brought camping chairs and were settling in like they planned to stay a while. Others were talking in groups, sharing stories about Frank Miller and their time in service. Craig approached Pete again, his voice desperate. He begged them to tell him what to do to make this right. He said he would do anything to fix his mistake. Pete exchanged glances with several other veterans before responding. Pete told Craig that he was going to come with them to see Frank Miller right now. Craig would apologize in person and hope that Frank accepted it. Then they would see what happened next. Craig agreed immediately and asked if he could close his shop first. Alan said that Danny could handle closing the shop. Craig needed to come now. Craig grabbed his keys and followed Pete to his truck. Several other veterans got in their vehicles to create a convoy heading to Frank's house. As the vehicles pulled out of the parking lot, people on the street stopped to watch. Some recognized what was happening from the news article and came out of their homes. A few waved American flags. Others just stood respectfully as the convoy passed. The story had taken on a life of its own now. It was no longer just about one man being kicked out of a gun shop. It had become a symbol of how the veteran community takes care of its own and holds people accountable for disrespect. National news outlets were starting to pick up the story from the local newspaper. Military news websites featured it prominently. Social media platforms saw the hashtag trending as thousands of people shared and commented. People who had never met Frank Miller were sending messages of support. Veterans from across the country were expressing solidarity. The story resonated because it touched on something deeper than just one incident. It reminded people about respect, honor, and the bonds formed through service. At a coffee shop in another state, a group of young veterans sat together reading the story on their phones. They talked about how quickly everyone had mobilized and how impressive the response was. One of them said this was what brotherhood meant, and the others agreed. In Frank's living room, Alan sat with him trying to explain what was about to happen. Frank looked overwhelmed and kept saying this was all too much. Alan gently told him that sometimes we do not get to choose when our impact on others becomes visible. Frank had touched hundreds of lives over his career, and now those people were showing him what that meant to them. Outside Frank's house, neighbors started gathering on their lawns. They had seen the news article and knew something significant was happening. When the convoy of vehicles started arriving and parking along the street, they watched with curiosity and respect. The crowd of veterans from the gun shop followed, and soon Frank's quiet residential street was filled with people and vehicles. American flags appeared from car windows. People stood in groups talking quietly. The atmosphere was serious but not angry. It felt more like a gathering of family than a protest. Frank stood at his window looking out at the sea of people and felt emotions he could not quite name. Pride, gratitude, confusion, and humility all mixed together. He had spent his life serving others and never expected anything in return. Now he was seeing just how much that service had meant. Frank stepped out onto his small front porch and looked at the crowd gathered in his yard and along the street. He counted at least 100 people, maybe more. He had tried several times to tell everyone this was not necessary, but nobody listened to his protests. Pete had told him firmly but respectfully that this was not just about him anymore. This was about all of them and what they stood for. Frank understood that argument even if he did not completely agree with it. He stood straight despite feeling tired, his eyes taking in the faces of people he had served with or trained over the years. Craig Patterson stood at the edge of the property looking terrified. Pete and Alan walked on either side of him as they moved through the crowd. People stepped aside silently to let them pass, their faces showing disapproval as Craig walked by. The weight of their judgment was heavy and obvious. Craig climbed the 3 steps to the porch slowly, like each step was difficult. He stood in front of Frank and the 2 men looked at each other for a long moment. Finally, Craig spoke, his voice shaking. He said he came to apologize and that what he did was completely wrong. He explained that he judged Frank based on appearance and treated him with disrespect. He admitted he was rude and dismissive and cruel. He said there was no excuse for his behavior. Frank watched him steadily and then asked why Craig did it. Craig struggled to find the right words. He said he thought he had gotten cynical from dealing with difficult customers. He made assumptions that were wrong, but he admitted those were just excuses, and the truth was that he was wrong and deeply sorry. The crowd remained completely silent, everyone focused on the conversation happening on the porch. Frank asked Craig if he knew who Frank was when he kicked him out. Craig said no, but added quickly that it should not have mattered. Every person who walked into his shop deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. Frank studied Craig's face for what felt like a long time. He had seen young men make mistakes during his career. He had watched soldiers learn hard lessons about integrity and character. He believed people deserved second chances if they truly understood what they did wrong. Frank asked if Craig understood why all these people were here. Craig looked out at the assembled veterans and said yes. They were here because of what Frank meant to them. He was not just a veteran to them, but family. Craig said he understood that now. Frank nodded slowly and said that was part of it, but there was more. He explained that the military teaches people that no one gets left behind. These people were here because they take care of their own. They were here to teach Craig a lesson about respect and about consequences. Craig said he understood and had learned the lesson. Frank was quiet for another moment, and then he extended his hand. He said the apology was accepted. Craig nearly collapsed with relief as he shook Frank's hand and thanked him repeatedly. But Frank was not finished. His voice took on the tone of a commander giving orders as he told Craig this could not just be words. Craig needed to change how he ran his business. Every person who walked through his door deserved respect, whether they were rich or poor, young or old, veteran or civilian. Frank asked if Craig could do that. Craig said yes immediately and promised he would. Frank said there was one more thing. He wanted Craig to create a policy at the shop where every veteran who came in got treated with extra care. Craig needed to train his staff on this and make it part of how the business operated. Steve Palmer called out from the crowd, asking if Craig would give veterans a discount. Craig turned and said he would give them 15% off. He added that he would also donate a portion of his monthly profits to local veterans organizations. A murmur of approval went through the crowd. Jack Monroe stepped forward and said they would hold Craig to those promises. Craig said he understood and wanted them to check on him. He wanted to prove he meant what he was saying. Lisa Hayes had been standing with her arms crossed, looking skeptical. But now she nodded slightly and said action spoke louder than words. They would be watching to see if Craig followed through. Craig looked at everyone gathered and said he knew he could not undo what he did. But he promised to spend every day trying to be better. He gave them his word. Frank put a hand on Craig's shoulder and said they would consider the matter settled. He told Craig to go back to his shop and start fresh tomorrow. Craig shook Frank's hand one more time and made his way back through the crowd. This time, a few veterans nodded to him as he passed. He had not earned their friendship, but maybe he had earned a chance to prove himself. As Craig drove away, the atmosphere relaxed. Someone brought out folding chairs from their garage for people to sit in. Another neighbor showed up with coolers full of cold drinks. What had started as a demonstration was turning into an impromptu gathering of friends and comrades. Frank tried again to tell everyone they could go home now. But Pete laughed and said half these people had traveled for hours to get here. The least Frank could do was let them say hello properly. Frank gave up arguing and accepted that this was happening whether he wanted it or not. For the next 2 hours, Frank's yard became a reunion. Veterans who had not seen each other in years shared stories and caught up on their lives. Young and old stood together talking about their service and their experiences. Frank found himself surrounded by people whose lives he had touched in ways he never fully realized. A young man approached Frank nervously and introduced himself as Tony Simmons. He said Frank probably did not remember him, but Frank had given a speech at his basic training graduation 10 years ago. Something Frank said that day had stuck with Tony through his entire time in service. Frank had said that being a warrior was not just about fighting, but about protecting those who could not protect themselves. Frank smiled and said he remembered giving that speech. He asked if Tony took the words to heart. Tony said yes and explained that he served 6 years, including 2 deployments. Frank's words had kept him focused on why he was there and what his purpose was. Frank thanked Tony for his service and felt moved by the story. Similar conversations happened throughout the evening, as person after person shared how Frank had influenced their lives. Each story reminded Frank of why he had devoted his life to military service in the first place. As the sun set, people finally started to leave. They shook Frank's hand or hugged him before walking to their vehicles. Some had tears in their eyes. Others smiled and promised to stay in touch. The street slowly emptied until only Pete, Alan, and a few others remained. Frank sat on his porch steps feeling exhausted but grateful. Pete sat beside him and said this had been quite a day. Frank agreed and said quietly that he was just one person who did his job. Pete shook his head and said Frank was proof that service meant something, and that honor mattered. 2 weeks after the incident at the gun shop, the first official meeting of the Watch Initiative took place at the VFW post. The room filled quickly with over 100 veterans of all ages. Some were World War II veterans in their 90s, while others were young men and women just out of service. Frank stood at the front, feeling nervous but also supported by the crowd. George Clark introduced him and everyone stood up clapping for almost a minute. Frank waited for the applause to die down before he started speaking. He thanked everyone for coming and said that 2 weeks ago he had a bad experience at a local business. He felt embarrassed and hurt but planned to just move on with his life. What he did not expect was for everyone to show up the way they did. Frank paused and his voice got thick with emotion. He said the response taught him something important about being stronger together than apart. It taught him that they had a responsibility to take care of each other, not just when someone was disrespected, but every single day. The room stayed completely quiet with everyone listening carefully. Frank explained that the Watch Initiative was not just about him or what happened to him. It was about building a support network for every veteran in the community. It was about making sure nobody fell through the cracks and everyone had someone watching out for them. He outlined the plan that had been developed over the past 2 weeks. Volunteer teams would be assigned to check on elderly or isolated veterans regularly. A job placement program would help veterans transitioning to civilian life find good work. Educational workshops would teach veterans about benefits and resources available to them. Frank continued by saying they would also work with local businesses and schools. They would provide education about veteran affairs and military service. The goal was to bridge the gap between military and civilian communities so people understood each other better. Pete Carson stood up to present the volunteer roster. Over 60 people had already signed up for different roles. Lisa Hayes would coordinate medical support to make sure veterans had access to health care. Steve Palmer would run the job placement program. Alan Hughes would lead the team that visited isolated veterans at their homes. Pete said this was just the beginning. As word spread, they expected the initiative to grow larger. They had already received questions from veterans organizations in other towns wanting to start similar programs in their areas. After the formal presentation, people broke into smaller groups to discuss specific projects. Some wanted to focus on mental health support. Others were interested in organizing social events to reduce loneliness among elderly veterans. The energy in the room was positive and productive. In one corner, Craig Patterson sat quietly by himself. He had asked to attend because he wanted to contribute. Many veterans were still unsure about him, but a few had started to accept his presence. He had kept every promise he made, changing his shop policies and making large donations to veteran causes. Frank noticed Craig sitting alone and walked over to him. He asked how Craig was doing. Craig looked up surprised and said he was okay. He just wanted to show his support for what Frank was building. Frank asked if Craig had thought about how his business could contribute to the initiative. Craig said yes and explained that he wanted to offer his shop as a venue for some of the workshops. He could provide training on firearm safety designed specifically for veterans dealing with challenges. Frank nodded thoughtfully and told Craig to talk with Lisa Hayes about it since she was coordinating the health programs. Craig said he would and thanked Frank for giving him a chance to be part of this. Frank told him that everyone deserved a second chance and that Craig was working hard to fix his mistake, which took real character. As the meeting ended, Frank felt a sense of accomplishment he had not experienced since his active duty days. He was building something meaningful that would last beyond his lifetime and help countless veterans in the years ahead. The next morning, Frank did his first major interview with a national news program. The interviewer was a journalist named Rebecca Turner, who had covered military stories for years. She asked Frank about his decades of service, the gun shop incident, and the creation of the Watch Initiative. Rebecca said Frank's story had resonated with millions of people and asked why he thought that was. Frank considered the question carefully before answering. He said people understood that respect and dignity mattered. His experience could have happened to anyone. The response from the veteran community showed that people still believed in taking care of each other. Rebecca asked if turning a negative experience into something positive was his intention from the beginning. Frank smiled slightly and admitted not at all. He just wanted to buy a rifle for hunting with his grandson. But when he saw how people responded and how much the veteran community was willing to do for one of their own, he knew they had a chance to create something lasting. Frank explained the Watch Initiative's goals and structure when Rebecca asked about it. He talked about the importance of community support for veterans, especially those who were elderly, isolated, or struggling to transition to civilian life. He said they served their country and now needed to serve each other. The interview aired that evening and was watched by over 2 million people. By the next morning, the Watch Initiative website had thousands of visitors. Donations came in from all across the country. Veterans organizations from other states reached out wanting information about starting similar programs. Frank found himself in an unexpected role as spokesman for a growing movement. His phone rang constantly with interview requests, speaking invitations, and consultation offers. He agreed to speak at veteran events across the state, sharing his story and promoting the Watch Initiative model. At a large VFW convention, Frank stood before an audience of over 500 veterans and their families. He told them he was just one person, not special or heroic. He was just a sailor who did his job for 32 years and then retired. What happened to him could have happened to any of them, but what mattered was what they did with these moments. He described the transformation over the past month. A month ago, he was embarrassed and hurt. Today, he was part of an initiative helping hundreds of veterans. That change did not happen because of him, but because good people saw something wrong and decided to fix it. The audience gave him a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Afterward, dozens of people approached with ideas for expanding the Watch Initiative. Several wealthy veterans offered substantial donations. Others volunteered their time and skills to help grow the program. A retired Navy admiral named Paul Henderson pulled Frank aside and said what Frank was building was important. Paul wanted to help take it national. With the right support and organization, the Watch Initiative could become a model for veteran support across the entire country. Frank said that was a big undertaking. Paul agreed but said it was needed. Frank had already proven the model worked. Paul asked Frank to let him help scale it up. Frank thought about his quiet retirement and his plans for fishing trips. Then he thought about all the veterans struggling and forgotten. He agreed to let Paul help. 6 months after the incident at the gun shop, the Watch Initiative had grown far beyond what anyone expected. Chapters existed in 30 states with over 10,000 active volunteers. The program had helped hundreds of veterans find jobs, access health care, and connect with their communities. Frank Miller had become a recognized voice in veteran advocacy. He testified before Congress about veteran support programs, spoke at military academies, and appeared on national television. But through everything, he remained the same humble man who just wanted to take care of his fellow veterans. On a crisp autumn morning, Frank finally kept his promise to his grandson Tyler. They drove to a hunting cabin in the mountains with rifles in the back of the truck. Frank had ordered a rifle online after the incident, but Craig Patterson had recently delivered a custom hunting rifle to Frank's home as a gift. Tyler said as they hiked through the woods that this had been a long time coming. Frank agreed and apologized for putting it off so many times. Tyler said it was okay because he understood why Frank had been busy. The Watch Initiative was helping a lot of people. They found a good spot and sat down to wait for game. In the comfortable silence, Tyler asked if Frank ever thought about how it all started, just because some guy was rude to him. Frank chuckled and said he thought about it all the time. Life worked in strange ways. One moment he was being kicked out of a store and the next he was running a national organization. Tyler asked if Frank thought Craig Patterson really changed. Frank said yes thoughtfully. Craig made a mistake, but he owned it and worked to fix it. His shop had become one of the most veteran-friendly businesses in the state. He employed 3 veterans now and had raised over $50,000 for veteran causes. Tyler asked if people could really change. Frank looked at his grandson and said people could change if they wanted to. Craig wanted to change. He was genuinely sorry and proved it with his actions. That was the difference between someone who just said sorry and someone who meant it. They spent the day hunting and talking and enjoying each other's company. Frank realized this was what he had been missing during the chaos of the past 6 months. This simple connection with family, the peace of nature, the satisfaction of teaching his grandson about patience and respect. As the sun began to set, they packed their gear and headed back. Tyler had gotten his first deer, and Frank had shared stories about hunting trips with his own father decades ago. Tyler thanked Frank and said he knew Frank was busy saving the world, but this meant a lot to him. Frank replied that Tyler reminded him why he did what he did. He helped veterans so they could have moments like this with their families. They could have peace and connection and purpose. The next week, the Watch Initiative held its first annual national conference. Veterans from across the country gathered to share success stories, discuss challenges, and plan for the future. Frank gave the keynote speech to an audience of over 2,000 people. He told the story of that day at the gun shop. Many had heard it before, but nobody tired of hearing it again. Frank said he learned something important that day about never being alone. He learned that bonds formed in service lasted forever. Even in the darkest moments, there were people who would stand beside you. He talked about the growth of the Watch Initiative and the thousands of veterans who had been helped. But he said this was not just about programs and numbers. It was about people. It was about a veteran in Ohio struggling with depression until his volunteer connected him with help. It was about a young veteran in Texas who found a job and could support his family. It was about an elderly veteran in Florida who was no longer alone because volunteers visited regularly. Frank paused and looked at the audience. He told them that every one of them made a difference. Every call they made, every visit they did, every hand they extended in friendship mattered. They were not just volunteers, but the embodiment of what it meant to serve. The audience stood and clapped for a long time. Frank saw tears on many faces, including his own. After the speech, Paul Henderson approached with news. The Department of Veterans Affairs wanted to partner with the Watch Initiative. They were proposing a grant program that would provide federal funding. Paul said it was incredible, but meant the Watch Initiative was about to get much bigger. They would need a full-time leadership team and formal organization structure. He asked if Frank was ready for that. Frank thought about his quiet retirement that now seemed like another lifetime. He thought about all the veterans who still needed help, and all the communities that could benefit from the program. He said he was 73 years old and was not sure he had the energy for that level of expansion. Paul said that was why they would build a team around Frank. Frank would be the inspiration and face of the organization, but professional administrators would handle daily operations. Frank had built something amazing, and now they needed to make sure it lasted for generations. Frank agreed. Over the next months, the Watch Initiative hired staff, opened a national headquarters, and began partnering with federal agencies. Frank's role shifted from hands-on work to advisory and advocacy. He continued to speak publicly and tell his story, reminding people why veteran support mattered. But he also made time for family, for hunting trips with Tyler, and for coffee with old friends. 1 year after the incident, Craig invited Frank to a ceremony at his gun shop. Craig had established an annual award for businesses that showed exceptional support for veterans. The first recipient was a small restaurant that hired 15 veterans and provided free meals to homeless vets. Craig said in his speech that this was what change looked like. A year ago, he was the problem. He disrespected a veteran and nearly destroyed his business. But Frank showed him grace and showed him that people could change if they were willing to do the work. Craig presented the award, then turned to Frank. He said he could never fully make up for what he did, but he could spend every day trying to do better. That was what the award represented, recognizing people who did the right thing and encouraging others to follow their example. After the ceremony, Frank and Craig spoke privately. Frank told Craig he had come a long way. Craig said he had good teachers. The veteran community could have destroyed him, but instead they held him accountable and gave him a chance to be better. That was a gift he would never forget. Frank said everyone made mistakes and what mattered was what you did afterward. As Frank drove home that evening, he reflected on the incredible journey. He had gone from a forgotten old veteran to a national advocate. He built an organization helping thousands of people. He turned humiliation into purpose. But more than that, he had been reminded of something he always knew but sometimes forgot. The bonds formed in service were unbreakable. Veterans took care of their own. Even in the darkest moments, there was light. His phone buzzed with a text from Alan saying thank you for everything Frank taught them, not just in the military but in handling adversity with grace. Frank smiled and replied thanking Alan for reminding him why he served. That night, Frank sat on his porch looking at the street. He saw more than just a quiet neighborhood now. He saw the site of a gathering that changed his life, where over 100 veterans stood in solidarity, where a community came together, where a movement was born. The incident at the gun shop was meant to diminish him. Instead, it revealed the strength of the veteran community and inspired a national movement. Frank spent 32 years serving his country in uniform. Now he would spend the rest of his life serving veterans in a different way. He had never been more proud. Frank woke up the next morning to find his phone ringing constantly. He looked at the screen and saw dozens of missed calls and text messages. His daughter Karen was calling from 2 states away, so he answered her first. Karen asked why he had not told her what happened. She had seen the story online and was worried about him. Frank explained that everything happened so fast he barely had time to process it himself. He told her he was fine and that the situation had been resolved. His story had gone viral overnight. The local newspaper article had been picked up by national news websites. Military blogs and veterans pages shared it across all their social media platforms. By breakfast time, the headline about the old veteran kicked out of a gun shop was trending on multiple websites. Frank made coffee and sat at his kitchen table reading through some of the articles on his tablet. He was amazed at how far the story had spread. People from all over the country were commenting and sharing their own stories about veterans being disrespected or about meeting Frank years ago. 3 news vans pulled up to Craig's gun shop before it even opened for the day. Craig had barely slept, spending most of the night researching veterans organizations and writing new employee policies. He looked tired when he stepped outside to talk to the reporters. He gave an interview right there on the sidewalk where dozens of veterans had gathered the day before. Craig told the cameras that he made a terrible mistake and disrespected a man who had given more to the country than Craig could imagine. He said Frank had accepted his apology, but that words alone were not enough. Craig outlined the changes he was making at his shop. He explained the 15% veteran discount, the new customer service training program, and the monthly donations to veterans groups. He also announced he was starting a scholarship fund in Frankie Miller's name to help children and grandchildren of veterans pay for their education. The interview was broadcast on the local morning news and quickly spread online. Public reaction was mixed. Some people praised Craig for taking real action to fix his mistake. Others remained skeptical and thought he was only doing it to save his business from failing. At the VFW Post, George Clark called a special meeting to discuss what happened. The room filled quickly with members who wanted to talk about Frank's situation and what they could do to help. George stood at the front and said the response to Frank showed the strength of their community. He proposed turning this energy into something lasting. George suggested creating a program to check on elderly veterans regularly and make sure they had support when needed. He also wanted to organize quarterly gatherings where veterans of all ages could connect and share resources. The members voted unanimously to approve the plans. They decided to call it the Watch Initiative because they would be watching out for each other. Several people volunteered immediately to help organize and run the different programs. Meanwhile, at a coffee shop across town, Alan sat with a group of younger veterans discussing the previous day. Chris Porter, a former Army Ranger, said he was impressed by how quickly everyone had mobilized. He had posted about it in his unit's group chat, and within minutes people were figuring out how to get there. Alan said that was what brotherhood meant. When one of them was wronged, they all felt it. Maria Santos, a former Marine, asked if Alan thought Frank really understood what he meant to all of them. Alan smiled and said he thought Frank understood now. The conversation shifted to other veterans in the community who might need support. They identified several elderly veterans who lived alone and could benefit from regular visits. They discussed organizing volunteer work to help with home repairs and yard maintenance for those who needed it. What started as a response to one incident was becoming a broader commitment to veteran welfare. The young veterans felt energized and motivated to do more for their community. At the local high school, a history teacher named Patrick Walsh decided to use Frank's story as a teaching opportunity. He showed his students the news coverage and led a discussion about respect, service, and community values. Patrick told his class that Frank did not demand respect, but earned it through a lifetime of service. However, the real lesson was that every person deserved basic dignity whether they had served or not. People should treat others well because it was the right thing to do, not just because of rank or achievements. A student named Jennifer raised her hand and asked if it was important for people to know about veterans and what they did. She pointed out that if the shop owner had known who Frank was, he would not have treated him that way. Patrick agreed that was a fair point and said it highlighted why better education about military service was needed. He told the students that most of them probably knew someone who had served. Understanding what that meant helped people appreciate the sacrifices made on their behalf. The discussion continued with students sharing stories about family members who served. Patrick felt good knowing his students were learning important lessons about character and citizenship. Back at home, Frank's phone kept ringing off the hook. Interview requests came from podcasters, news shows, and documentary makers. A literary agent even called suggesting Frank write a book about his years of service. Frank felt overwhelmed by all the attention. Pete stopped by to check on Frank and found him looking stressed. Frank said he was not interested in being famous and had only wanted to buy a rifle. Pete laughed and said whether Frank liked it or not, he had become a symbol. His story resonated with people because it touched on something important about how we treat each other. Frank asked what he should do, and if he should just hide until it all blew over. Pete said no, Frank should do what he always did and lead by example. If Frank wanted this to be about more than just himself, he should help turn it into something bigger and more lasting. Frank asked what Pete had in mind. Pete explained that the VFW was organizing support programs. Younger veterans wanted to start mentorship initiatives, and several businesses wanted to do more for veterans. Frank could help coordinate and inspire all these efforts. Frank sighed and said he was 72 years old and had been looking forward to a quiet retirement. Pete said respectfully that Frank had never done anything quietly in his life. The community needed him not because he was famous, but because he knew how to bring people together and get things done. Frank looked at the photos on his walls again, seeing the faces of young people he had trained and led. He thought about the gathering in his yard and how many lives he had touched. He thought about Craig, who made a mistake but was trying to become better. Frank finally agreed and asked Pete to tell him what needed to be done. Pete smiled and said first Frank needed to accept some interview requests. He should tell his story but also talk about the broader veteran community and remind people that thousands of veterans deserved respect and support. Frank said he could do that. Pete then said Frank should help organize a veteran support initiative, and they should call it the Watch Initiative, because they would be watching out for each other. Frank liked that name better than naming it after himself.